very much indeed for the opportunity to talk to you about the crises that we face. The world today is clearly in the middle of an economic crisis of unprecedented proportions. According to the IMF, quote, "By any measure, this downturn represents by far the deepest global recession since the Great Depression," unquote. The speed of decline has been astonishing and has caught forecasters unawares. Only last July, the IMF were forecasting that world GDP would grow by 3.9% in 2009, and they've just come out with a new world economic forecast this April, and they're predicting world GDP would contract by 1.3%. So a downward revision of over 5 percentage points in only 9 months. Huge change. At the same time, total expected write-downs on global credit markets and on global exposures are now estimated to be likely to be around $4 trillion US, which, just to give you a sense of the scale, is about the same size as Japan's annual GDP. Financial intermediation between borrowers and lenders has been seizing up. At the same time, the prospects for an eventual climate crisis, if global action is not taken, are worsening. Extrapolating from the rates of greenhouse gas emissions recorded in the most recent decade of data, some climate models suggest that there is at least a 50% chance of global temperatures rising by more than 5 degrees centigrade above their pre-industrial level by the end of this century. The last time the world was that hot was about 30 or 50 million years ago. And the temperature change would be more than separates us from the last ice age. But we can reduce the risks of climate change sharply if we can bring about a transition to a low-carbon economy. And public action to tackle the unprecedented global slowdown can be a crucial part of that effort. So in this talk, I want to argue that first, uncontrolled climate change would be very dangerous, and second, the need for a global fiscal stimulus provides an excellent opportunity to accelerate efforts to halt man-made global warming. Let's start with the first leg of that argument, which I'm sure is very familiar to all of you. Let me remind you, though, briefly, why human-induced climate change is such a problem. It's basically a market failure on possibly the greatest scale that the world has ever seen. Greenhouse gases spread and mix in the atmosphere quickly. Everyone is affected, but in different ways. Those who produce greenhouse gas emissions impose costs on others that are not recouped from the emitters. Gases emitted today will affect the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for a very long time to come. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for around 100 years on average. Some of the greenhouse gases, sulfur hexafluoride for instance, stay in the atmosphere for several thousand years. There's broad scientific consensus that human-induced climate change is taking place, but there is great uncertainty about the degree of change and the size of possible economic, social and ecological impacts, which causes immense problems for designing appropriate policy. These economic, social and ecological impacts are potentially very large and irreversible. Climate change is inequitable in its causes and in its effects. Per capita energy-related emissions of carbon dioxide are nearly 20 times as high in the United States as they are in India. Developing countries are, on the whole, more dependent on agriculture, which is likely to be the sector of the economy hit first and hardest by climate change, and they're more vulnerable to drought and flooding. So collective action is needed on a global scale, because markets cannot be relied upon to deal with the externalities involved. I'm sure many of you have seen this so-called glowing embers slide from the IPCC, which just reminds us, gives us a sense of how the extent of global temperature change matters and how varied the impact of climate change can be. In March this year, the International Alliance of Research Universities organised an international scientific congress to provide an up-to-date synthesis of research on human-induced climate change. So this is more up-to-date than the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. And this colloquium suggested that, first, greenhouse gas emissions this decade have been increasing as fast or faster than in previous worst-case scenarios. Sea levels are predicted to rise further than previously expected. There's growing concern about the ability of the land and the oceans to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are more worries about reaching potential tipping points, like the disappearance of summer sea ice in the Arctic, at global temperature increases of as little as 2 degrees centigrade or less. At the same time, there's been a lot more research on the possible social and economic consequences of climate change, and in particular, increasing recognition of the potential for mass displacement of populations in the regions likely to be affected most, and serious implications for the welfare and security of populations around the world. Now, according to the work of the International Energy Agency, this problem of human-induced climate change is not going to be solved simply by the world running out of hydrocarbon fuels. There are probably another 4.5 trillion barrels of oil in the ground, which can be recovered at less than $80 a barrel. And that alone would be enough to increase carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere by a third. Once you start looking at natural gas and coal, it's clear that there are enough hydrocarbons around to take the world into a very dangerous place. And that's basically why action is urgent on the climate change front. Starting planning now with clear targets and good policies will allow measured action and will keep the sum of costs down. Waiting to see how technologies develop risks raising costs. If we get close to the target that was discussed in the Stern review of greenhouse gas concentrations of 550 parts per million, but fail to find a magic bullet to decarbonise the global economy, the costs of stabilisation will then look just like they look today, but we will have got a much higher stock of greenhouse gases in the air. At the moment, we're at about 430 parts per million. But starting to act now allows time to replace capital equipment in a timely way and would minimise premature scrapping. Delay is likely to mean rush decisions when the enormity of the challenge finally sinks in. Early movers, both governments and businesses, have the opportunity to set key standards, to build capacity in new technologies, influence the design of regulation around the world, and create new markets. There are likely to be substantial co-benefits of early moves as well, in terms of increasing energy security and reduced local pollution. But key to keeping the costs of emissions abatements under control will be good public policy to tackle the market failure at the heart of the problem. And that's where the need for a fiscal stimulus comes in. Now is a very good time to be promoting the case for a firmer foundation than dot-com bubbles and property booms for sustainable growth, and to undertake some of the public spending necessary to bypass the market failures that stand in the way of climate change policy. Now, I'm going to talk primarily about public deficit-financed spending. I do want, however, to emphasise that along with this, we will need pervasive and steady pricing of carbon as the key economic tool to correct the central market failure in this problem. But there are many other market failures involved with the climate change nexus, in particular in research, development and deployment of new technologies, in the exploitation of untapped sources of greater energy efficiency, in the network economies associated with electricity grids and other public infrastructure. And it's in these myriad of other market externalities where the rationale for some public deficit finance spending is located. Now, my focus is very much on the need for a global fiscal stimulus, but it's quite clear from the debates taking place in the UK and Ireland, amongst other countries, that there's some scepticism about whether a large fiscal stimulus is a good idea and what scope there is for individual countries to partake of such a stimulus. Tax and spending policies are not always the right tools to use for macroeconomic adjustment. And in the LSE paper, which the Chairman mentioned, which is here, we went through some of the academic literature to see and to try to understand better what the constraints on deficit finance are. But I think it's clear that with near zero nominal interest rates in most major industrial economies and a global financial system in crisis, we can't rely on monetary policies alone in current circumstances. And the very careful empirical work that the IMF has undertaken over the years of past tax and spending initiatives suggests that a general fiscal stimulus across countries is more likely to work in circumstances like the ones we now find ourselves in. Government investment and carefully targeted tax breaks are likely to give a bigger bang for the buck than general tax cuts or general income transfers. This chart from an IMF publication just before the G20 meeting in London this year compares the impact of 4 different ways of implementing a global fiscal stimulus. It's calibrated to a 1%, to a stimulus which is 1% of annual world GDP. And it uses the IMF's global integrated monetary and fiscal model. Now, the stimulus is phased in over 2 years, and you can see that the third set of lines that government investment gives the biggest bang for the buck. Indeed, a fiscal multiplier of considerably more than 1, given that there is monetary accommodation assumed in this model. Transfer payments that are perceived to be temporary, by comparison, have only a limited effect on the spending of those households who are able to focus on their lifetime incomes, whereas government investment has a direct effect on aggregate demand. Now, these estimates of the so-called fiscal multipliers assume that governments slowly return to their original levels of government debt after the 2-year period of stimulus. So the need for eventual fiscal retrenchment is recognised in the exercise here that the IMF has carried out. So, how big a fiscal stimulus globally is appropriate, or I should perhaps say would have been appropriate, given that governments around the world have already started down this direction? Well, ideally, I think one would like to have seen an effort to offset the whole downward shock to world GDP this year and next. According to the IMF in March, support by government stimulus packages already announced by then would have boosted GDP in 2009 in the G20 countries by somewhere between 0.75 of a percentage point to 3.25 percentage points, depending basically on the size of the uncertain fiscal multipliers. If you take the IMF's own estimates, I think the figure would have been to the upper end of that range. And yet, despite these packages already announced by March, the IMF is still in its new forecasts, forecasting growth this year to be more than 5 percentage points lower than they expected as recently as last July. So I think that a global fiscal stimulus of over 5% of world GDP would have been appropriate, with at least half of that comprising discretionary and time-limited tax and preferably spending measures. Now, my colleagues and I suggested in the LSE paper mentioned that around a fifth of the discretionary measures should be in extra public spending on broadly defined green measures in the next year or so that would start along the road of climate change policy I talked about earlier. And the rest, the other 80%, should at least avoid encouraging and locking in high carbon activities. So if one's looking at infrastructure investments, say in health and education, which don't look as if they're directly focused on the climate change problem, these infrastructure investments should at least avoid locking in low energy efficiency and high carbon heating systems. Now, if government spent around a fifth of discretionary measures on green measures, this would still leave room for appropriately diversified fiscal packages, including especially the measures needed to restore financial systems to health. And it would be roughly in line with estimates that various bodies have made of the incremental investment necessary to get the world economy on an appropriate low-carbon trajectory. Given the general economic outlook and the uncertainty about the future global framework for climate change policies, it seems likely that the public sector is going to have to foot the bill for much of this incremental investment liability over the next couple of years. Now, it's important for holding governments to account and indeed for the effectiveness of fiscal policy that it doesn't consist simply of throwing money at problems. And it's quite clear that we should be able to do better than the textbook example of Keynesian economics, digging holes in the road and filling them in again. It's important that any proposals for deficit finance measures are effective in fighting the economic downturn. In other words, that they have sizable fiscal multipliers. They generate social benefits in their own right, so cost-benefit analyses would support the individual spending plans involved. And it's crucial that there should be an exit strategy made clear at the time the measures are taken. That is, either the measures themselves are time-limited, or there are specific proposals for funding when fiscal retrenchment becomes necessary. Now, in the LSE paper, we offered an informal assessment of a number of specific green proposals, and I've kind of reorganised some of the ratings that we came up with in this slide. So suggesting that if one takes the list of criteria related to the criteria I've just mentioned, are the measures timely? Do they have a long-term social return? Do they have positive lock-in effects with low-carbon technologies? Do they create jobs domestically? Do they ensure that they don't interfere with the economy coming back to equilibrium? In other words, are we targeting areas with slack rather than targeting areas where there are still resource shortages? And are the policies time-limited or reversible? And we I think clearly one set of measures that benefited, according to virtually all the criteria, was promoting residential energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings for greater energy efficiency. There's been a great deal of discussion in the UK, and I'm sure here, about accelerating investment in large-scale renewables projects in order to decarbonise the power sector. But it seemed to us, perhaps with the UK planning system in mind, that there was very little that accelerating large-scale renewables could do in time to help with the current economic downturn. And so I've written in nuclear power here is not so good, but I think the same would be true of large-scale tidal barrages in the UK, for instance. Long-term social return, energy-efficient lighting has a very good payback period, a very short payback period, and has co-benefits. Positive lock-in effects from smart production techniques, because they lock in new ways of doing, carrying out activities once the monitoring, once the smart devices are in place. Producers are not going to revert to the old ways of doing things. But something like carbon capture and storage, even when plants have carbon capture and storage working, it may be quite easy for that carbon capture and storage basically to be turned off if it becomes too expensive, unless there's some sort of regulatory backup. And in any case, I think it can well be argued that carbon capture and storage has to be a transition technology and not a part of the very long-term energy mix. I won't go through all the other examples. The key points to make are that it is possible to take advantage of low interest rates, low raw material costs, and unemployed workers with broadly the necessary skills to get through a backlog of work, for example, in promoting energy efficiency in the home. And in some other cases, notably the transformation of the power generation sector, the lags between policy decisions and results will mean that climate change policies that are desirable in their own right are going to make very little of contribution to short-term economic recovery. Also, I think with those large-scale projects, long-run financing mechanisms are more of an issue, particularly given the evaporation of a lot of project finance in current circumstances. In a report prepared on behalf of the German Foreign Office and submitted to the G20 London Summit this year by the Grantham Institute and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, we argue more generally for urgent action under the 7 headings that you see here. The need to improve energy efficiency, to start upgrading physical infrastructure, supporting clean technology markets so that the private sector can start making the smaller scale investments that are appropriate at this stage, enhancing international collaboration on research and development, incentivising private sector investment in green technologies, and coordinating the efforts of the G20 countries so as to develop an appropriately diversified portfolio of measures. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that there's more scope for large discretionary fiscal packages in some countries than in others. Among the factors to consider are how big a recession there is in the country concerned, how open the economy is, how high government debt is relative to GDP to begin with, whether there are other reasons why the government's long-run fiscal credibility might be in question, such as large contingent budget liabilities, public sector pensions, for instance, and whether there have been any large-scale structural changes in government's ability to raise taxes. In the latter respect, the UK has a particular problem with a likely structural decline in tax revenues from banking, finance and property sectors. Now, this table, I hope you can read it. It's taken from another IMF publication, and it shows how the G20 nations had by March already announced significant discretionary fiscal measures. They're in basically in this column here, the penultimate column. And overall for the G20, they amounted to just over 1% of G20 GDP. The USA was well above the average, China further still, the UK at less than half the average, just half a percentage point of GDP. Now, the decision-making for governments is complicated by the fact that there are the so-called automatic stabilisers at work in the tax and benefit system. And you can see here, the automatic stabilisers column, that in some countries, for instance, the EU members of the G20, automatic stabilisers have come into play and have had an impact of over 2 percentage points of the relevant country's GDP. So there's less room for discretionary measures. But there is some room. And I guess the column which is most problematic or draws attention to the biggest difficulty here is the apparently innocuous other column here, which basically gives some indication of what the IMF thinks has happened to structural tax capacity. And I prepared this slide originally for a UK audience and wanted to pick out the fact that the IMF thinks the long-run tax capacity of the UK has declined by nearly 3 percentage points, only 1.2 percentage points for the G20 as a whole. So there's less scope, basically, in the UK for discretionary fiscal stimuli. And the question of long-run financing of green investments actually is a short-run challenge as well. Now, this morning I was having a look at the European Commission forecasts for EU members and discovered that the figure for Ireland for the deterioration in the overall fiscal balance corresponding to this column here would be getting on for 12 percentage points. So we think in the UK we've got a problem. I guess here you've got one in spades. That, in a sense, simply in an accounting identity form, suggests there is a very big fiscal stimulus going on, but it's basically not from discretionary elements. So I think for both the UK and Ireland, the message of my talk has to be somewhat modulated and basically is a bigger challenge for our countries, both to ensure that there are long-term funding measures in place and to look at other elements of action against climate change, in particular establishing a strong price signal that makes people internalise the costs of carbon. Now, I think having explained why some countries are simply unable to take such a big step to increase public spending on green issues, it is still somewhat worrying that the share of such fiscal stimulus as there is has not been very large in some cases. And this chart comes from HSBC estimates in February, so it predates, for instance, the recent UK budget. HSBC tried to work out what proportion of total discretionary stimulus by different countries could be labelled green. And you can see it goes from 6% for Spain, 7% for the UK, up to a massive 80% for South Korea, which has decided there's a strategic objective of making them one of the leading low-carbon economies. The recent UK budget would have nudged that 7% figure up a little bit, but it doesn't get anywhere near the 20% figure which we were advocating in our LSE paper. So, In conclusion, I think the economic crisis could be the shock that persuades policymakers around the world that growth should be set on a new and more sustainable path. But I'm not sure that everyone has yet risen to the challenge, and I'll be very interested to hear your views on this. Thanks very much indeed.